Larry, we have been friends. And you respect my dad and I respect you, but I will put fucking bullets right through your heart. You put that fucking gun down now.
God damn you, Joe. Don't make me do this.
Larry, stop pointing that fucking gun at my dad!
A group of criminals plan a diamond robbery that ends up going horribly wrong. This week, we discuss who Jerry Seinfeld is scared of, the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath, and what you shouldn't eat if you're planning to make out with someone. Lend us an ear, boo, as we find out if Reservoir Dogs stands the test of time.
Test of time, James and Alan have to say, do the movies you love still hold up today? James says gladiator with a glut, Alan says as a father blah blah. It's the test of time, James and Alan have to say, do the movies you love still hold up today? Test of time, James and Alan have to say, do the movies you love still hold up today?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Test of Time podcast. I'm your host, James Brief, and joining me, as always, is our friend, our director, Alan Noah.
Who's our?
I guess me and you, but also the listeners. You are our director, Al.
Oh, okay. I don't know that everyone else agreed to that, but sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Alan Noah, and today we are going to be talking about Reservoir Dogs, which is our first movie written and directed by Quentin Tarantino. It's not the first movie that we've done that was written by Quentin Tarantino. That was True Romance, which we did with our friend Jason Torres. Hi, Jason. I'm sure you're listening. Hope you're doing well.
Actually, Quentin Tarantino had an uncredited script rewrite of The Mighty Ducks.
Is that true?
No, it isn't.
I didn't think so. But maybe I shouldn't start the episode by saying this, but I will be honest. I'm not the biggest Tarantino fan, and I know that that's sacrilege to some people. I know he is worshipped and idolized, and people will run out to see the new Tarantino movie. He's never really had that appeal to me. What's your take on Tarantino?
I think he's great. I don't really watch his films over and over. I mean, you know, they're not the kind of thing like I want to see again and again, but I've liked every Tarantino film I've ever seen. So, you know, I would say I'm a fan of his. I think he makes great films. I do think he makes Tarantino films. He's not like you'd say a Steven Spielberg who makes everything from Ready Player One to Schindler's List. Like, I would say, you know, he has his genre, and I think he's very good at it.
Right. There's always a lot of talking and pop culture references, or maybe not always in like the period movies, but, you know, a lot of violence. There's always violence, right? Has there been a Tarantino movie that didn't have a lot of violence in it?
Well, I haven't seen every one of them, but I imagine the two films of his that I haven't seen are still pretty violent. I've never seen Jackie Brown, and I've never seen, what was the last one he made? It was The Magnificent Six or The Hateful Eight.
It was The Hateful Eight, but then after that, there was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I haven't seen his last three movies. I didn't see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood or The Hateful Eight or Django Unchained.
Oh, I saw Django Unchained. You remind me, yes. I did not see... actually, I guess I haven't seen a few of them. I haven't seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I did not see his half of the double feature he did with Robert Rodriguez.
Grindhouse.
Yeah, Grindhouse. I did not see that one, but I assume that one was quite violent.
Yes, it was. I remember going to see that in the theater when it was both movies, and it was like long to sit through both of them. But Courtney and I did that years ago. I remember the first time I saw Reservoir Dogs, it was on a date in college, and a girl who I'd met invited me to her dorm room to watch a movie, and I was expecting the night to go in a different direction than the direction it actually went in, which was we sat there and actually watched this movie. Not a great movie, if you're hoping to make out. It's not like a scary horror movie where, maybe you'll need to just snuggle up for protection or anything like that. It's not a comedy. This is a pretty terrible makeout movie. And I will fully admit that there was zero making out that happened that night.
It's a great first time to see it story. I saw this film. I've mentioned this in the past before with some films like Kids and Clerks. There was a friend of a friend in high school that was really into all these indie films, and one night this was the movie that he showed. And in the beginning of this film, it's a lot of just talking, and I'm like, oh God, is this like a movie that takes place in a diner? Like, I really, while the dialogue is mildly interesting here, I mean, the first scene does not draw you into the film like, wow, this is going to be amazing. I do remember seeing Pulp Fiction in the theater. That one I saw when I was like 16. And to a 16-year-old, that was like, whoa, this is crazy.
I don't think I saw it in the theater. I feel like I must have seen it on VHS at some point afterwards. I don't really remember vividly. I mean, I remember everyone was talking about it. And then once Pulp Fiction sort of became like a hit and people were talking about it, because of that, a lot of people then went back and rediscovered Reservoir Dogs, which kind of was released with less fanfare. Sort of like, after Mallrats was released, then people went back and saw Clerks if they had missed it the first time around. But let's focus on Reservoir Dogs for now. So this movie is about 6 criminals who are strangers, and they're hired to carry out a diamond robbery. But the heist goes south, and when the men meet at the rendezvous point, they begin to suspect that they were set up. So this movie was not a big hit, right?
Oh, absolutely. This film, it had a $1 million budget, and that seems about appropriate. It's got no real special effects or anything like that, and it was released October 23rd, 1992, and it wound up grossing about that much domestically and $2.8 million worldwide. So this is a film that I'm sure there was an article in Entertainment Weekly or something like a provocative indie film that blah 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 A-. But the success of this film gave him the opportunity to make Pulp Fiction, which launched him to superstardom.
Right. I mean, this movie goes back to when Tarantino was working at a video store, and he was going to make this movie for like $30,000 with his friends, and somehow the script ended up in Harvey Keitel's hands. That's how he was able to get, $1 million to make it. Then the movie premiered at Sundance, and it was like the hit of the festival. And people who saw it at Sundance and then Cannes and the Toronto Film Festival, people really liked it. But, still when it was released, it wasn't like a blockbuster.
Right, and this is the kind of film that might have been like, oh, it stars Harvey Keitel, and I guarantee when Pulp Fiction came out, it was John Travolta and Bruce Willis. Now it's like the 8th film from Quentin Tarantino. Like, he is the star of the films.
Yes, this is true. And so the movie starts with all of these guys who are sitting in a diner, and it starts with Tarantino talking about Like a Virgin, the Madonna song. And, this movie comes out in 92, so I guess that's fairly topical, relevant, timely. And he has this theory that Like a Virgin is about dicks. It's all about this woman has sex with a guy who has a really, really big dick and it hurts. And that's what Like a Virgin means. And it's sort of funny to hear like these macho tough guys talking about not just this song, but when they go back and start talking about like, well, her song True Blue, that's about being in love, but this song is about dick. You don't realize it at the time if you saw it right when this movie came out, but it's very Tarantino-esque. And I was reading that Madonna apparently liked this movie, and she sent Tarantino like an autograph that said, it's not about dick, it's about love. So his theory was wrong, but he makes a compelling argument.
Yeah, these are definitely monologues that Tarantino has had in his head. And I don't know how it really fits in this film. I mean, he has a great monologue like this in every one of his films. In Kill Bill, there's a great monologue about Superman and Clark Kent. And this opening scene, age differently for me, because I think one of the most famous parts of this scene is Steve Buscemi's part. You first meet the guys, and you don't really know what's going on, because they don't discuss the robbery or anything, but they're all in a diner, and Joe, the mob boss that's hired him, he decides to pay the bill, and he's like, everyone cough up $1 for the tip, which even in 92 seems like a pretty stingy tip if you think about it. But Steve Buscemi's character, he initially does not want to tip, because he goes into this impassioned idea about, why should I tip someone for doing their job? And I admit, I used to kind of think this way, the idea of like, why am I tipping this person, a waiter, when I don't tip the guy at McDonald's? Like, they're both low paying jobs, but I never realized that McDonald's, their minimum wage is whatever it is then or now, but the minimum wage for waiters is still today like $2 an hour. It's something insane, because the minimum wage accounts for them getting tips as part of their salary.
Right. And I think a lot of these little details and nuances are supposed to give you some insight into the character. When Tarantino's ranting and raving about Madonna, it's not really important to that character. I mean, he's Mr. Brown, and we don't really see him throughout the movie. Like, he pops up in one other scene later in which he dies. But for Mr. Pink, I think we're supposed to be getting that, like, he's a man of his convictions, and he feels very strongly that he should not give this $1 for the tip. But then when the boss, Joe, says, you better throw in a fucking dollar for the fucking tip right fucking now, Mr. Pink, Steve Buscemi's character, says, yeah, okay, fine. And that's sort of like his character. He has his feelings, he has his opinions, he'll let you know his feelings, but when the boss tells him to shut up and pay, he'll shut up and pay. And like he says later on, I'm a professional. It's sort of like that's his thing.
Oh, I love this guy, the guy that plays Joe. He's played by a guy named Lawrence Tierney. I mean, he is terrifying. This guy is so imposing. And I know, Al, you never saw Seinfeld, but he played Elaine's father. Elaine was Julia Louis-Dreyfus. And the story goes that he was incredibly intimidating in that episode, the character, but actually he was terrifying to all the people on set, and you never saw the character of Elaine's father ever again. You saw Jerry's parents, you saw George's parents, you even met Kramer's mom, but you never saw Elaine's father again. And that was not a decision that they made based on the character, or that the character died or something. They were just terrified of Lawrence Tierney. And Jerry Seinfeld in an interview once said that everyone was just freaked out by him, that he was so scary. And when Joe goes to Mr. Pink and he says, put up a tip. I paid for the meal. You better fucking put $1 down. Mr. Pink, I mean, he's like, okay. And I think he kind of uses logic that, all right, you paid the meal, I'll pay the tip. But also, it's because this guy is really scary.
Right. And then after they leave the diner, there's a slow-mo shot of the guys walking in the parking lot. I believe we mentioned it in our Swingers episode that like they're talking about it in the movie Swingers, and then they kind of copy it, like that slow-mo walking scene.
Yeah, this is a classic scene, and it feels like Tarantino always wanted to do that again, because he does probably even a better version of it in Kill Bill, when he has whatever the gang of assassins are. In Reservoir Dogs, it's so cool. You know, I mean, they're horrible people, but it just looks awesome.
I think they're supposed to look both cool and menacing. And then it goes to the credits. And then we're after the robbery. So the diner scene takes place before this diamond robbery. And then we cut immediately to after the diamond robbery, which is another thing that Tarantino's known for, is telling his stories out of sequence. And this movie is kind of notable because it's kind of all centered around this one heist, but we never see it. We hear about it, but the scene that takes place after the credits, it's Mr. White and Mr. Orange, and Mr. Orange is bleeding out in the back of a car, and Mr. White is driving him to the rendezvous point. Mr. White is played by Harvey Keitel, and Mr. Orange is Tim Roth. And Mr. White is like really being comforting to Orange. He's saying, you're not going to die. You're going to make it. And Orange is pissed. He's like, I'm dying. This hurts like hell. I can't believe she shot me. We don't know who the she is in this scenario just yet. But like they're holding hands in the car. Like you definitely see right away that there's a bond between these two men.
You know, the character of Mr. White, Harvey Keitel's character, he's a morally corrupt guy, but I would say he has a conscience. He has empathy for another human being, which certainly we'll find out later Mr. Blonde has zero empathy. He's a sociopath. And Mr. White, he's a bad guy, but he's not a sociopath.
I was reading something that said that Mr. White is a sociopath because he's a professional criminal and he has some loyalty, but Mr. Blonde is a psychopath because he enjoys torturing people and like killing people. I'm not 100% well versed on the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath. I don't know if this is really accurate, but just something I read.
That's very possible. I do not know the exact definitions of those two terms, but I just think it's really interesting to show the difference between these characters.
Right. But White brings Orange to the warehouse, which is where they're all supposed to meet up. And Orange continues to just bleed out on the floor. And then Mr. Pink shows up. That's Steve Buscemi. And Pink is saying that it was a setup. The cops were just there. Usually, you know, if you rob a store, someone hits the alarm and then you have a couple of minutes. But the cops were right there, so it had to have been a setup. And they don't know who it was, but, you know, they're questioning everyone. And he also is saying that Mr. Blonde was responsible for the whole thing going south because Mr. Blonde just started shooting people, started shooting civilians. He didn't have to do that. That was just him being crazy. Mr. White is pissed off. He's like, I can't believe that Joe picked this guy to work on this job. He says that he knows Joe, he respects Joe, and he's really pissed about what happened with Mr. Blonde. And then who shows up at the warehouse? But Mr. Blonde. He's played by Michael Madsen, and he is just as cool as a cucumber. You know, like while they're screaming at him and talking about what a murdering psychopath he is, or was it a sociopath? I've already mixed them up. But like he just shows up with like a fast food drink and is like, hey guys, what's going on?
Yeah, he shows up, and not only has he robbed and murdered a bunch of innocent jewelry store people, but we find out he's also kidnapped a police officer, thrown him into his trunk, and while this is all going on, he decides, I'm going to stop at a Jack in the Box or something. Because he even mentions that he did have French fries. So the guy stopped for food, presumably with a cop in his trunk. It's, I don't know what the word is, something psychopath, sociopath, but this guy he's like the Joker.
It's not a Jack in the Box. It's a Big Kahuna burger, which is also in Pulp Fiction. I read that in the IMDb trivia. I didn't catch that on my own.
Oh, that's great, because there is like a Tarantino verse.
Yes, at one point in this movie, in one of the flashbacks, I think Joe or Mr. White says something about Alabama, who is Patricia Arquette's character in True Romance, just like in passing, just to show that they're connected.
And Mr. Blonde, he is the brother of John Travolta's character in Pulp Fiction. They're both the Vega brothers. And I think at one point, I'm not sure if he was talking about it, but he mentions this guy Marcellus that went to jail. In Reservoir Dogs, they say he's going to jail for 20 years. If that's Marcellus Wallace, Vig Rhames from Pulp Fiction, presumably he got out of jail a little early by the time Pulp Fiction comes out.
There's a lot of these connections in the Tarantino verse, little things like that along the way. But they bring this cop into the warehouse, and then Eddie shows up, and Eddie is Joe's son. He's played by Chris Penn. Actually, he's known as Nice Guy Eddie. And Eddie is not being so nice at this point. He's pretty pissed off about what happened. And he says that they need to ditch some of the cars. So he and White and Pink are going to get rid of some of the cars. And they're going to leave Mr. Blonde in charge of Mr. Orange and the cop. And Orange is just lying on the ground bleeding, so there's not much to do there. And the idea with the cop is they can question him and ask him if it was a setup, who is the man on the inside, who ratted them out. But as soon as the other guys leave, Blonde says to the cop, just so you know, I'm not interested in finding out information. I'm not going to question you. I'm just going to torture you because I think it's fun. And this is the part of the movie that I think everybody remembers or that people have heard about when he dances around to Stuck in the Middle with You by Stealers Wheel and cuts the cop's ear off.
Oh, I'm sure this is a great part of your date, Al.
I mean, really, it's just like, how do you make a move at that point? It takes a smoother guy than me to do that.
Absolutely. You must have just thought, all right, I am not hooking up tonight.
Yes, that is basically what I thought. Also, she was eating like a tuna sandwich, like as we were watching the movie, which is not something you eat if you're planning to make out with somebody.
Wow. Yeah. Strike two. The one thing about the cop that I'll say aged very well for me is that I must have first seen this movie on standard definition television, and I remember thinking that the special effect of the ear was pretty fake. And I actually have to say, I'm sure you watched it probably on HBO Max like I did.
Yes.
Watching it in high definition, I think they did a really good prosthetic job on this cop. I thought it was really disgusting and cool. One thing I always loved in this scene is it's not just music in the background that kind of is part of the soundtrack of this film, because after Blonde cuts off the cop's ear, he walks out to his car and the music perfectly fades as if it's just taking place in this building. And it's a striking reminder that the horrible torture that's going on here, there's regular people outside. You kind of hear in the background kids playing on the next block, some basketball or something, or there's cars driving by. This is not one of these torture in the middle of nowhere, scream all you want, no one's coming. The cop was screaming, but it's amazing that this is just taking place right in Los Angeles. And Mr. Blonde just so cool as a cucumber. He gets out to the trunk, he takes out a tin of gasoline, and then he slowly and casually walks back to the warehouse, and then the music comes back on.
It's one long shot from when he cuts off the ear, and you don't actually see the ear cut off. The camera pans up, you hear the scream, and then it pans back, and he's holding the ear, and he tosses it. Then he walks outside, he walks back. So it's all one continuous 30, 45 seconds. And then he starts dousing the cop in the gasoline. He deliberately throws it on the open wound on the side of this guy's head. And he's about to light him on fire when all of a sudden Orange wakes up from his wound. He's lost a ton of blood. He's been out of it for a while. You can forgive the man for that. And he shoots Blonde 4 or 5 times, or maybe he unloads his entire clip on him.
Oh, it's 10 or 15 shots. It's an entire magazine.
Right. And at that point, it's pretty clear that Orange was the cop. He was the undercover cop. And we'd gotten a couple little flashbacks before this. We saw that Blonde was really close friends with Joe, and he was very loyal to them. Blonde had done time in prison, and he could have done less time in prison if he had ratted out Joe, but he didn't. He was a good bad guy, I guess, and didn't give up the boss. And so, that's why they put him on this job, because he really wants to get back to work, doing this heist. But then the scene with Mr. Orange's backstory, that's a lot longer. We really go deep into what his story is. And he's a cop. He gets in good with these guys. In order to really sell that he's a scumbag, he has to learn a joke. Not really a joke, more of an amusing anecdote about how he almost got busted with a ton of drugs. And to me, that whole moment didn't really pay off, because the funny anecdote that the cop is telling him, you have to memorize, and if you're going to be undercover and you're really going to sell it, you really have to be able to convince these guys that this really happened to you. The story is just not that funny. It's he was holding pot and there was a drug dog that barked at him, but the cops didn't care. It's not a really witty anecdote.
I do agree with you on that. I think that the actual story is, I think I remembered it being a lot cooler and a lot funnier when I first saw it. One thing I do love is I love how amazing these cops look. I mean, these cops are straight out of Central Casting. I'll tell you, they look exactly like all the cops in Super Troopers.
Yes, I was just about to say that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they all have that, like, khaki green, like, I guess, like, state trooper outfit, and they all have that mustache that, like, the Super Trooper cops have. And I do find it interesting, at least, that we're watching a flashback here of a story that never happened. So I do think that that's cool. Like, he's telling the story well enough that you, as the viewer, are kind of following along as if this was a real story.
I get what you mean. I just felt like the other flashbacks were like pretty quick, and this flashback is really long. And then like there is this kind of like flashback within the flashback of him telling this fake joke. You see that he is getting in good with Joe and Eddie and these guys, and that's why they trust him on this job. But now we know that he is the cop. He is the person who set everyone else up. You know, Mr. Pink was right. Then Pink and Eddie and White all show up back at the warehouse, and they find Blonde shot, and Orange is lying in a pool of blood, and they're like, what the hell happened? And Orange's story, to explain it, is that Blonde was going to kill everybody as soon as they got back and steal the diamonds. Eddie immediately like kills the cop, just puts him out of his misery. So, you know, it's not like the cop could corroborate the story. Not that they would have believed him anyway, because he's a cop. But with the backstory that we know, of course, Eddie isn't going to believe Orange saying that Blonde was going to turn on them. Like, Blonde is super loyal. He has proven himself to be loyal. He did 4 years in jail for Joe. Why would he turn on him now? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
You're right. Unfortunately for Orange, he doesn't know the backstory of Mr. Blonde. You know, maybe he could have gotten a little background on Joe's associates and maybe, you know, kind of looked through some mugshots and seen, oh, I know who Blonde is. Blonde is this guy. And they could have been like, oh, yeah, he's been running with Joe and Eddie's gang for years, and he went away to San Quentin for a few years. Like, it's possibly could have known that, but I also think it should have been a better story. He should have just been like, yeah, he was going to set the place on fire and I was gonna die because the guy's a total psychopath. He just picked the wrong story. I don't think it was a bad story that he picked, but he just was ill-equipped to make that story.
Right. And then Joe pulls a gun on Orange because he's quite sure that he's the cop, and of course we know that he's right. But Mr. White then pulls a gun on Joe and says, no, you can't shoot him. He's bleeding out. We need to save him. Because, like we were saying earlier, White had empathy for this guy, and he really believed that he was a good person, and he doesn't want him to die. And then Eddie pulls a gun on White. So now they're in this Mexican standoff. White is saying, I don't want to kill you, Joe. I like you, but you can't shoot this guy. If you shoot him, I shoot you. And then Eddie's saying, if you shoot him, I shoot you. And then they all fire and they all fall down. I rewound this scene twice because I just didn't get it. Who shoots Eddie? Joe has a gun on Orange. White has a gun on Joe. Eddie has a gun on White, but no one has a gun on Eddie. And then like they all fire and Eddie falls down.
I assume Harvey Keitel kills both of them. Like he shoots Joe, and then as he's going down, he shoots Eddie.
I think that's what was supposed to be the case. And then I was reading that apparently Chris Penn's squib, you know, the thing that shoots out the fake blood, actually went off early. So that's why he kind of falls down at the same time when he really shouldn't have. I also thought maybe it was Pink, who is like in the warehouse at that time, but isn't really like involved in the Mexican standoff. Maybe he was off to the side and then he just shot whoever was left standing. But I think you're right. I think it was supposed to be White, but it doesn't read that way at all. And it's a little confusing and like maybe not the most important detail, but if you're going to have all of these guys die, then someone should have had a gun on all of these guys. It's a little bit of a sloppy Mexican standoff. Or rather, a little bit of a sloppy conclusion to the Mexican standoff.
Yeah, it is a little confusing. But what happens next really doesn't make sense to me because Joe and Eddie are dead. Mr. White, Harvey Keitel, he appears to be mortally wounded. Mr. Pink, Steve Buscemi, he's like, okay, I'm just going to take the diamonds and leave, probably like what I should have done, an hour ago, movie time wise. And he decides to leave, and then you do hear a lot of cops coming in and converging on the warehouse. And then what happens is Mr. Orange, Tim Roth, the cop, he's being held in the arms of a presumably dying Mr. White, and he confesses to him. And he's like, I'm so sorry, I am a cop. Like, why did he confess?
So that's a really good question. I do have an answer for that. Quentin Tarantino said that people ask him that all the time, but nobody who's Asian asks him that. And it's because there is this concept in Japan called jingi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. My apologies if I'm not. But it doesn't really have an English translation. But it's this concept that Mr. Orange has to do what is necessary, and he owed Mr. White. So he has to confess, and he has to do it before the cops come in. Like, he has to do it where Mr. White has the opportunity to do whatever he wants with that information. White can either kill Orange in anger or he can spare him, but it has to be Mr. White's decision. And you're right, it is confusing. It is weird. It's a concept that I don't think really translates to our society because, yeah, I mean, this guy is literally seconds away from making it out of this situation, going to a hospital, getting patched up, getting a lot of blood transfusions, and living, but he picks the worst possible time to come clean and make this confession. And then it very much seems like Mr. White puts the gun to Orange's head, kills him as the cops are walking in, and then they kill him too.
Yeah, the only explanation I could give, not based on why the character does it, but from an artistic point of view, is that in some ways you can make the argument that Mr. Orange deserves to die, Tim Roth's cop character, because how did Mr. Orange get shot? We find out in a flashback that White and Orange, they escaped the robbery, and they're like, fuck, Blonde went crazy, let's get out of here. Their car stops working.
Well, that's because of Blue, Quentin Tarantino's character. He's shot and is driving, but then he dies.
Oh, yes. That's Mr. Brown is Quentin Tarantino. Yeah, right. You're right. He's fatally shot, presumably in the robbery, probably by one of the cops. And their car is dead. And they carjack this lady's car. And as they're like, get out of the car, she takes a little pistol out of her glove compartment and she shoots Orange in the gut. And, I guess out of instinct, he kills her. And he just assassinates and murders an innocent civilian who was just protecting her property. Probably stupid. She should have gotten out of the car. They probably wouldn't have killed her. But he murdered someone, for no good reason. There was no reason to do that. I think it was just instinct. But after doing that, I guess you could say morally the character is compromised.
Right. I mean, that's exactly what an undercover cop should not do, in that situation. And you're right. It was panic and adrenaline and all that stuff. But he has crossed a line where, assuming he does make it out of the situation and he lives, he's going to have to answer for that. But it becomes a moot point because he's dead. It's not totally clear what happens to Pink. I thought I heard that there were shots fired as Pink ran out of the warehouse, and I thought that it was clear that he died. I was reading something that said you can kind of hear in the audio that he's arrested, so presumably he does live, but it's not really clear either way.
I agree with what you're saying. I've read that trivia too. The first time I saw this, I thought he got away with it. And I thought that was so cool. I thought that was fine. Because Pink is probably the only guy that's not a complete scumbag. He might just be a robber. And even Pink was like, why the fuck did Blonde start shooting? Meaning Pink had no intention of killing anyone. I actually thought it was probably okay for Pink to get away with it, because they do mention at one point that the jewelry stores are, I believe he used the term, that they're insured up the ass,
Right.
and that the jewelry store's not going to lose any money from this. I mean, yes, I mean, the insurance company has to pay for this, and ultimately, like, people do pay for this, but I thought it was cooler that he gets away with it. I think that would have been a cool ending, or just making it completely vague. But knowing that trivia and listening, it is pretty clear that the warehouse is surrounded and there's no way that Pink got away with it.
Right. But like, why do the cops wait so long to go in? Orange at one point says that they're just waiting for Joe to get there, which seems a little bit weird that he has to walk into the warehouse before they make their move, especially considering this other cop, is tortured and then killed while they're sitting outside. But also, once Joe does go in, they have time for this whole Mexican standoff. I mean, it's, I don't know, a couple of minutes where, the cops don't move in. Like, holy shit, what the fuck are they waiting for?
Well, they had to wait for Joe to go in because Joe had to be in the same vicinity as the stolen diamonds. Like, that would put him at the scene of the crime. That's what they had to wait for. But you're absolutely right. Thinking about it, why didn't they go in immediately? That's not clear. I guess you could make the argument that they were not, like, literally right next to the warehouse. Otherwise, Joe driving up would have seen 20 squad cars. So the only thing I can imagine is that they were, like, 10 blocks away, and there was like some plainclothes cop that was just kind of walkie-talkieing in and being like, I think he's in, waiting for confirmation, and then once he confirms they're in, and I guess you could just, the cops fucked up. Like, I guess that's also a possibility.
I suppose so.
One question I want to ask you, what is the point of Mr. Blue? Well, we didn't talk about this guy, but he's an older gentleman in this film, probably like Joe's age, and he is seen in the first scene. He has like no dialogue. He is killed off screen. I'm totally fine with a character that's there for cannon fodder, that he dies to show the situation is serious, but I did not remember this character being in the film at all, and I don't really see the point of him. Do you know why he's in the film, or am I forgetting some kind of small contribution of his?
No, he has no contribution. I saw something that apparently they only wrote the diner scene because Tarantino wanted to give him like a line or two, which he has in that first scene. I mean, clearly it's not anything memorable. Like, I don't remember what he says, but yeah, he's just a guy who he's there and then he dies. I mean, there is really no point to him at all. But now that we've got that sorted out, do you think that Reservoir Dogs stands the test of time?
This is the first film of Tarantino. He gets a lot better at a lot of the stuff that he does here. I think the diner scene, it doesn't hold up as well as I remembered it. I remember thinking that this was a real slick dialogue scene, but I think this film could have opened up in the backseat of the car with a bleeding guy and, whoa, what's going on here? And you could slowly piece the story together there. I think it could have sucked you in a little quicker. It's kind of a slow beginning to this film. I think Tarantino certainly got a lot better at his openings. I mean, I don't know if you saw Inglourious Bastards, but
I did.
What an opening. Wow. But, I mean, he gets a lot better at certain things. I'm not going to talk about the budgets. Obviously, the fact that he could have 100 people in the samurai scene of Kill Bill, that's not fair to compare. I think the cast here is fantastic. I wouldn't say necessarily that he gets better casts. I just think that Tarantino has the ability to consistently get amazing casts. And I think it's to the point of everyone in Hollywood wants to be in his film. And it's like, you've really made it when you're in a Tarantino film. And, he has that cachet. We mentioned it before that it's no longer like Brad Pitt in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's Quentin Tarantino's film starring whatever A-listers I got to star in this, and you're going to watch it. Tarantino has certainly stood the test of time, but just about this film, this movie plays out a lot like a play. I think you could really do this on, not Broadway, but this could be like an off-Broadway kind of play. And I think that for what he does with it, I think it's a very intriguing film. I think it does take a little bit to get into it, and he does do the out of sequence stuff a little better at Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill. And I don't think in the end we get the full story of what happened. And I get we don't need to see the robbery scene, but I do think with a bigger budget we would have seen that robbery scene. I don't buy that it's an artistic choice not to see it. I think it was probably because, for $1 million, you're not going to get that jewelry scene.
Apparently, you're right that it was like a budget thing that prevented him from shooting the heist. But then he said that he actually kind of liked that idea that, it's all about this heist, but you never actually see it. So I think it was sort of like because of the budget, but then he kind of just leaned into that.
I mean, I think they do a great job of working around the fact that we didn't have to see the pivotal scene of this story, which is the robbery. He's Quentin Tarantino. It would have been a great scene. And I kind of wanted to see Mr. Blonde just, why did he go crazy? And did he just kill worker after worker? Like, I'm just curious as to what happened there and what happened to Mr. Blue, what happened to Mr. Brown. I mean, I get what happened to Mr. Brown, but I will say that what we got, it's an early Tarantino film, but it works. This is not my favorite Tarantino film. It's a nice film, but it's not as grab you as some of his other films. There's no scene like Inglourious Basterds or Kill Bill that kind of like has you after it's over like, wow. Like, that opening scene in Inglourious Basterds, you're kind of shaking. But it's still a really fun film. Very well done. And I'm going to say that, yes, Reservoir Dogs does stand the test of time. What do you think, Al? Does it stand the test of time?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not a big Tarantino fan. And watching this movie, I was reminded of all of the reasons why I'm not a Tarantino fan. The things that I don't like about Tarantino is mostly the pointless jabbering that I think goes on way too long in a lot of his movies, and the excessive violence that, in my mind, is pointless. Violence can be used in a movie to tell a story, and it can also just be gratuitous. I find the violence in this movie to be gratuitous and unnecessary and not narrative driven. The way I look at this movie is Tarantino wanted to do something really violent. He wanted to do something really disturbing, and mission accomplished. He did it. There are interviews where he says that he wanted that torture scene to disturb people. And when he hears that people walked out of the movie theater, or they did, back in 92, he says, well, that's okay. It wasn't for them, but I did what I wanted to do. I wanted it to be disturbing. I wanted it to affect people, and it did. So yeah, mission accomplished, Tarantino, but to what end? What's the point of this movie? What is the story that he's telling? What's the message? What is it about? I get it that you can really dig into the power dynamics of how this person acts in one scene and, Joe is the boss, and you really get the sense of that, and how Pink and White are so anti-Blonde. They're really pissed off at Blonde, but then Blonde shows up and they kind of defer to him. And, it's all about this machismo and this bravado that gets them all killed. Okay, I just don't find it that interesting. I really, really don't. To me, it's hollow. It's kind of pointless. I think we live in a real world where this kind of violence does happen, and to see it glorified and done in a way which, in my opinion, doesn't really serve any story purpose, to me just feels pointless and kind of irresponsible. I don't think this movie stands the test of time. I just don't see anything about it that's really worthwhile as a narrative. I will say the soundtrack is great. People know Stuck in the Middle with You because of this movie. People know Coconut because of this movie. That's a good thing. Those are good songs. Hooked on a Feeling, I think, also got more popular later in the 90s with that Dancing Baby meme, the early days of memes, by Blue Swede. Ooga chaka, ooga, ooga, ooga chaka. that's great. Stephen Wright as the DJ who's like playing all of these hits of the 70s. Like, that's a funny gag. I like that gag because he's like the most deadpan voice in the world. Who would ever make him a radio DJ? Like, that's kind of funny. But overall, I don't think the movie stands the test of time. Well, I don't love Quentin Tarantino, and I don't love Reservoir Dogs, but how will I feel about Pulp Fiction? We'll find out next week when we review that movie for episode 250. 250!
250!
That was my air horn sound.
I love that sound effect.
I don't like the real sound effect. I like it when me and Courtney and the kids do like our terrible impression of it. I like that way better than the real sound effect. But there will be air horns galore in episode 250. This is a moment. This is a milestone. Don't miss that episode. Subscribe, like, follow. Talk to us on social media. We are at Test of Time Pod. We love hearing from everybody. Send us some nice thoughts about hitting the 250 mark. Visit our website, testoftimepod.com. Find some of our old back episodes. Listen to those. And we'll see you next week, everybody, for episode 250.
See you at 250.